So back to my quote here from the cover of my book, because I think this sort of contains everything I want to say, and we sort of expand out from there. Visionary creatives swim in the culture of their day. So I'm distinguishing visionary creatives from people who are just creative. And as I described from these other types of people, actives, leaders, producers, nurturers, somnambulists, that we don't all have to be creative, but there are other virtuous human roles. And my definition of visionary creativity is that it's embedded in its culture and at the same time pushes it forward. The things they create in art, design, science, technology, business. So I'm not limiting creativity to the arts. My argument is, very opening of my book, I compare Michelangelo and Mark Zuckerberg. Now everybody said, oh, why didn't you pick Steve Jobs? Everybody hates Mark Zuckerberg. He's a jerk. Everybody loves Steve. He's a jerk. Steve Jobs is a jerk too, but everybody loves him. Well, I was taking Facebook, the way it embeds us in a network as being the culture of our day. And just the way Michelangelo was embedded in and drove forward the humanism of his day, Mark Zuckerberg is embedded in and driving forward the networking of his day. Embody that spirit. So the visionary creative is part of the spirit of the time. And at the same time, we're a little off center for us, somehow not what we expected, because the visionary creative sees something we don't see, the rest of the culture doesn't see, and is creating work to pull us into what they see and thereby restructuring our consciousness. So we might say that an essay can tell us what to think, but art tells us how to think. In other words, an essay, if you want to tell somebody facts, deliver content, you can write an essay. If you want people to experience the world differently, then you create art. And the art restructures how people perceive and experience the world. And I said, becoming a creative, I quote Nietzsche, the three metamorphoses of the spirit, Camel, which is the taking on and mastering your culture, whether it's your culture generally, what's the literature, art of your time, and of your discipline. What are the techniques of your discipline? And then the willingness, we grow up respecting our better teachers, saying, boy, he's really cool. I like to be like him or her. But then you eventually, they don't get it. They're not up with it. And you have to challenge and eventually destroy that culture, which Nietzsche says you become a lion, and you can do that. The culture is the dragon, and the lion fights the dragon. But then to create the new, you become a child, a wheel rolling out of its own center. So then I thought, okay, in my book, I talked about Einstein, Dali, Nietzsche, Rowling, Jobs. on and on. I got a list later. We can't become like them. So what is the, okay, we should know about Picasso, but are we going to become a Picasso? And how do we relate to these figures? And I think one way we relate to them is seeing one of the things they did, which is, what if? And we can do that at any scale. It doesn't have to be overthrowing the established art world of the day. So I started with Gregor Mendel. So I thought a lot about genius. And there's some really bright people. It's interesting. Anybody sort of watch over the years Big Bang Theory? Anybody not know what it is? We all know it's a sitcom about 4 bright Caltech professors and researchers and their girlfriends. Well, the bright one, Sheldon, who started college at age 11, and one of the early episodes, his roommate has a necktie hanging on the doorknob, and he goes to Penny next door and says, "What does that mean?" She says, they're, getting on with it. He says, "Well, what does that mean?" He says, she says, "You went to college." He says, "Yeah, but I was 11. But then Sheldon never does anything. Sheldon, he writes some important papers, but he never does that Nobel Prize thing. We're going to see how it wraps up. I think next year is the last year. Well, so what is genius? And I make the argument is genius is getting discovered. There are bright people who don't get discovered. They're not geniuses. So, and then it has to do with being bright. Einstein was bright, but Einstein also had an insight. But you can also have an insight and be persistent. So Gregor Mendel, who can tell me what Gregor Mendel did? Anybody else? Okay.
He created the concept of Punnett square and genomes and the concept of genetics.
Right.
Yeah,
do you know what the trick was? The insight was?
What? Well, his experiment was he studied pea plants.
Yeah. So to oversimplify, some peas have white flowers and some peas have red flowers. So everybody thought they knew what would happen if you crossbred them. You'd get pink flowers. But Mendel discovered, no, you get 3/4 of the offspring have red flowers and 1/4 have white flowers. None of them have pink flowers. What'd that tell him? That there are genes. Now, Darwin didn't know about this. He should have. He had Mendel's paper, but he didn't read it. So Darwin believed in blending. If you have a tall mate and a short mate, their offspring will be medium. Now, if you have a mutation for a tall one, they'll mate with a normal one. Their offspring will be a little bit tall, and then the little bit tall one will mate with a normal one. And their offspring will be a little bit less tall, and the mutation will go away. Darwin couldn't make it work. He had this theory in Origin of Species, but he never made it work. Because he didn't know about genetics, which we understood later, but he should have because Mendel had worked it out. And that is that it doesn't blend, it's discrete. And so the gene for the red flowers is dominant. So if you get 2 red genes, you'll get a red flower. If you get 2 white genes, you'll get a white flower. But if you get a red and white gene, you'll get a red flower. not a pink flower, because the red gene is dominant, or the gene for the red flower is dominant. So Mendel worked all that out just by breeding peas in the garden. A monk who twice flunked his exams to become a teacher. And then he's worked in this monastery doing his pea experiments. And then the monastery had tax problems, so he had to give up his experiments and work on the paperwork. And he got so agitated that he got overweight. So his doctor told him to smoke to lose weight, and he died of cancer. So that's Mendel. But he just had this insight and just worked on it. He wasn't bright. He wasn't a genius. Couldn't even pass his exams to be a teacher in a monastery. Einstein. So, of course, Einstein was brilliant, but the physicist Henri Lorentz and Henri Poincaré, the mathematician, were hot on the tail of they were all working on the same thing, which is, if I throw a baseball to you and it goes 100 miles an hour. Now, if I'm in a car coming toward you at 100 miles an hour and I throw a baseball, it's going to come at you at 200 miles an hour. If I'm going away from you 100, let's say 90 miles an hour, and I throw it at you, it's going to come at you at 10 miles an hour. You add the velocities. Light didn't do that. Light was always 186,000 miles per second. And by the late 1890s, they could measure it really precisely. You could measure the speed of light like, within fractions. They use interferometers that would overlap the wavelengths of light to see were they in sync or out of sync. So they can measure the speed of light within with extreme accuracy. And no matter what they did, it was always 186,000 miles per second. Why? So Lorentz produced the Lorentz transformations, which said, well, at the high speeds, the ruler you use is expanding or shrinking, or all these convoluted attempts. And Poincaré was really getting close. And then also later for general relativity, there was another mathematician who was honing in on. But Einstein was able to do something. He said, what if I assume there's no absolute space? Imagine there's a grid in this room that we see in perspective paintings, and it extends all through space. So everything that moves relative to this absolute space. Well, what if there is no absolute space? Well, how can there be no? What would it be moving? If my hand's moving, what's it moving relative to my other hand? Well, what if I move both of them? What are they moving relative? And then the Earth is moving, and the solar system's moving. There's got to be something that's moving relative. Einstein said, what if there's nothing? It's all bootstrapped. And it was that enabled his breakthrough. His ability to say, what if I assume there's the one thing that everybody thought was the most important thing. What if drawings don't have to look classical? What if typeface doesn't have to be lined up? What if you don't have to get rid of widows and orphans? Igor Stravinsky. It's a great story. And if you're interested, there's a pretty good description of it on Wikipedia. There are books about it, but there was an impresario, Sergei Diaghilev, was Russian, and he was producing these ballets. And yet Picasso did the scenery, and some important person did the dance, choreography, and Stravinsky did the music. They did the Firebird. It was very successful. And then they did Rite of Spring. So Stravinsky says, well, what if I make it, I played some of the music for you a couple of weeks ago. What if I make it a primitive drums driving human sacrifice? The audience rioted. That's all you need in Paris. His reputation was made. Elvis Presley was this huge fan of country music. There's a point where he said, what if I take the country music classics like Blue Moon of Kentucky, speed them up, intensify the beat, and back them with an aggressive guitar, rock and roll. He was just a natural. But he didn't compose any of his music. He took established classics and played them to his own instincts. Yeah.
He also stole a lot from his contemporaries.
They all work together. Yeah, there's the $1 Million Quartet.
No, I mean, he took like the cadences and specific songs from like musicians of color over the time and reperformed them as his own.
Yeah, I'm looking for, it's in my book, but who did Blue Suede Shoes first? I should, I'm not sure I have my book on here. If I did, I could do a search and get it real quick.
Which song did you say?
Blue Suede Shoes.
It says Carl Perkins.
Carl Perkins, thank you. So Carl Perkins, so there was this little hole in the wall storefront recording studio, Sun Records, Sam Phillips. And Elvis went in to cut a record for his mother for her birthday. And the receptionist called up Sam and he said, don't let him leave. And just to make the racial point, he said, if I could ever find a white man who sounded like a black man, we'd make $1 million. And that was Elvis. So he had Elvis, Carl Perkins, Billy Lee Riley, Conway Twitty, whole lot of shaking going on. He's still alive. Anyway, he had a lot of the pioneers of rock and roll. Well, Carl Perkins did Blue Suede Shoes and Elvis did a cover. And Carl started appearing on TV and everything. And he got in an auto accident. Well, this other guy's available. Next thing you know, he's the king. So, you know, the most lauded performer of all time. So Johnny Cash wrote Ring of Fire for his future sister-in-law, June Carter's sister. And he said, well, what if I do it and add mariachi-style Mexican horns? He got his biggest hit. And these are all music examples. The Beatles asked, what if we use a symphony orchestra in a rock album? The result was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, referred to as the most important rock and roll album ever. And then Bob Dylan was a really interesting character. He really went on the road and hung out with everybody and, you know, built up his credibility and his ability. And I was in school. My sister was into a lot of cool stuff, and she brought home this record. And she put it on the phonograph. I took it off. It sounded like somebody stepped on a cat. It was Bob Dylan. So he was doing folk. He was identified as a folk artist. He did acoustic guitar, and he had a following. And then at the Newport Folk Festival, he picked up an electric guitar, and they booed him. And he stuck with it, and he became one of the most important cultural figures of the 20th century. He won a Nobel Prize for Literature. That ain't bad. I believe that whatever we're doing, we should be inspired by biography. People you're interested in, what did they do? And whether it's just interest, whether you want to be inspired by it, whether it suggests things you might do, but also it unfolds how people thought and their impacts. So one of the people who I've always been aware of is Claude Shannon. He wrote a little book, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which I got, always had it. And he basically created the entire modern world. And if he hadn't done it, someone else would have, but he did. So 1948, he was a 36-year-old researcher at Bell Labs. Now, Bell Labs was in a building in the West Village in New York, and they hired really bright people and left them alone. So this was the phone company. The phone company was a monopoly, AT&T. They had plenty of money, and it was a monopoly. There was no competition. They were the phone company. How does this work? How much information can you pump through a phone line? How can we understand it mathematically? So Shannon sat down. He said, let's work that out. So first thing, what is information? And the first thing he said is, information has nothing to do with content. So, and information has to do with entropy. And how do you measure information? Well, it's what can be done with bits, ones and zeros. In other words, how many bits will, if I take a paragraph of literature or gibberish, and I want to send it to a telegraph line or a telephone line as information, I translate it to ones and zeros, and how many ones and zeros it takes to code that paragraph tells us how much information is in it. Nothing to do with content. Then, how many ones and zeros per second I can get through the channel tells us the capacity of the channel. So now we can say, is this phone line have more capacity than that phone line? We have a scientific way of defining and measuring what we're doing, which the phone company up to that point, until 1948, couldn't do. And they were working on this all along. Shannon and Turing, who created the modern computer called Turing machine. Turing flew over and worked at Bell Labs. They hung out with each other. So the whole world, the whole modern world, was percolating in that building. They also just happened to invent the transistor down the hall. So what Shannon had done in that paper was invent information theory. And he created a definition of information and created information theory. Well, it turns out, it was only later realized, this was his second move. The first one was his master's thesis, in which if I say, okay, if A and B are true, then you get C. If A is true and B is not true, then you get D. If A and B are both not true, then you get whatever. That's called Boolean algebra. So George Boole, English mathematician, in the, I think, late 1700s, worked that out. It's called Boolean algebra. And I had an algebra class, just one hour lecture about it. We didn't do it. It was just told about it by the teacher. But it was well understood. But what Shannon figured out was, wait a minute. These are simple mechanical rules. If A is true, circuit is open, then the electricity goes, if you have two circuits in parallel, if they're both closed, the electricity goes through. If one is open, it can't go through. If both are open, it can't go through. But in series, if they're in parallel, then if one is open, the electricity can still go through the other. So if A is not true but B is true, you get a circuit. If they're both not true, you get no circuit. It's called a computer chip. That's the circuitry of computers. He did it for his master's thesis. The paper was preceded some years earlier by Shannon's MIT master thesis in electrical engineering in the 1840s. The English mathematician and philosopher George Boole developed what's called Boolean logic, which formalizes a set of rules for which, for example, we might say, if A and B are true, then you get C. If A is true and B is not true, then you get D, etc. In his 1937 master's thesis called A Symbolic Analysis of Relay and Switching, Shannon showed that these rules could be built into electrical circuits, enabling the logic operations to be automated, thus laying the foundation for all electronics, including modern computers. So nobody thought anything at the time, but later they said, oh my God, this is the most important master's thesis of all time. How many people have heard of Shannon? Anybody? One. In other words, Shannon developed a science on which our entire digital age is built. Shannon's one of the most important scientists of the 20th century, indeed one of the most important visionary creators of all time, but it's hard to get recognition in a field that no one knows about because you just invented it. There's no Nobel Prize in information theory. Shannon never got the Nobel Prize. There's no Nobel Prize in mathematics. The guy in A Beautiful Mind, I don't remember his name, but he got the Nobel Prize for game theory in, what was it in? Anyway, he invented game theory. So, is Shannon a genius? So if you go around and you say, you stop, well, let's say 50 professors at Pratt, not people in the street, but, educated people. And you say, genius, not genius. Einstein, Picasso, Mozart, Shannon. Most people, now, the biography came out 2 years ago. So now, and there's a movie about Turing about 2 years ago. So these people are starting to get recognized. But before 5 years ago, nobody ever heard of these people. They just created the modern world. How many people have heard of Hedy Lamarr? So she's a 1940s and 50s movie star. So she was billed as the most beautiful woman in the world. She was German, and German or Austrian, I'm not sure which. But she was married to an industrialist, a munitions manufacturer. And she did a movie in Germany called Ecstasy, in which she appeared nude. So everybody was, and this is the 1930s, so everybody was talking about it. And the American film industry went over, grabbed her, brought her over here, and made her a major star. And she starred with Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, Charles Boyer, and was, maybe one of the top 3 leading ladies, the top movie stars of this age of the silver screen. Desiring to help America during the Second World War, she worked in her living room with avant-garde musician turned Hollywood composer George Anvil. designing advanced electronic controlled weapons. Their efforts were focused on guidance systems. So you're shooting a torpedo from an American submarine at a German submarine. You want it to detonate a certain distance before it hits it. It's easy to detonate when you hit it, but you want to detonate a certain distance away. You want to keep control of your torpedo, and you want to block and jam anything that the German submarine's doing to interfere with your electronic control of your torpedo. They invented the whole thing. Their efforts were focused on guidance systems and proximity fuses, looking for ways to detonate a weapon at a given distance from its target and ways to defeat an enemy's attempt to jam the guidance in detonating signals. Their designs are forerunner of today's smart bombs, as well as playing roles in cell phone, Bluetooth devices, GPS guidance systems, and other devices. She invented the whole thing. Lamarr and Antle were more suited to their tasks than one might have imagined. Both were very smart. Lamarr had been married to a wealthy Austrian munitions manufacturer and sat in on some of his negotiations, and Antle had built complex mechanisms for his machine-age concerts. So they use piano rolls, player piano, where the spikes on this tube play the keys, so you can have an automated piano. They use that to randomly reset their electronic guidance system so that it could not be interfered with. And the Defense Department says, we can't fit a piano roll in a torpedo. It's just a proof of concept, cooling. In 1942, they received patents, but never any recognition, never got a penny. But then in 1997, when she was 82, she was honored for her work by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, really cool organization. His honor was, he had died. 2003, she was featured as a leading woman of science in a series of Boeing commercials, and her work was chronicled in a 2011 book, and now there's a movie. But it's hard to be taken seriously in the field of high-tech weaponry when you're the most beautiful woman in the world. So she never, do you get recognized? So maybe when you're 90 and had too many facelifts. And then we all know about Vincent Van Gogh. So anybody ever see the Doctor Who about Vincent Van Gogh? Okay, well, can you find it on YouTube? Is it on YouTube? I don't mean now, but if people look for it.
Yeah, I saw it on Facebook. So
Okay, so look on YouTube. It's widely regarded as the best Doctor Who. There are a lot of good ones, but some people say it's the best. But Doctor Who and his time as Assistant Amy have traveled to today, whenever it was made, London. And they're at an exhibition of Van Gogh paintings. And in one of the paintings, there's a house, and in the window is a space monster. Doctor Who recognizes this is a dangerous monster. So we have to go back to 1890 and kill the monster. And they got Van Gogh's help in confronting the poor monster. They have to kill it. But anyway, they get Van Gogh's help in killing the monster. So they kill the monster, then they go back and it's no longer in the painting, so good. It's not going to threaten the world. But they realize Van Gogh's going to commit suicide. And can we help him? So they said, well, what if we bring him to today and let him see this exhibit and see how people are appreciating his art? So they take him to the present for an exhibition's work in Paris. I thought it was London, but maybe it's Paris. Van Gogh is overwhelmed by the enthusiastic reception for his paintings, And then deliberately in earshot of Van Gogh, the doctor goes to the exhibit curator, who's played by Bill Nighy in very solemnic British style. Where do you think Van Gogh rates in the history of art? And the curator says, well, big question, but to me, Van Gogh is the finest painter of them all. Certainly the most popular great painter of all time, the most beloved. His command of color, the most magnificent. He transformed the pain of his tormented life into ecstatic beauty. To my mind, that strange wild man who roamed the fields of Provence was not only the world's greatest artist, but also one of the greatest men who ever lived. So then you say, well, this is fiction. Van Gogh never heard that. And it would have been wonderful if he had. But did he need to? He wrote, but did he need to? He wrote to his brother Thiel, wings, wings to fly above life, wings to fly above the grave and death. That is what we want, and what I am beginning to understand that we can get them. We see from Van Gogh's letters that his greatest despair was not his misfortunes, but his inability to fully convey in his paintings the luminous world he experienced. As much as we admire what he accomplished, he wanted to accomplish so much more. So I think these people can be inspirations. And we need to go beyond Stockstead, the textbook. That gives us the framework. I like to describe the education. If you get a good education, it gives you a framework. For the rest of your life, you can fill in that framework. As you encounter things, you have a place to put it. I'm a believer in the survey art history course because when you encounter some incredible Renaissance art, say, oh, I know where that fits. After medieval and before Baroque. I have a place to hang it. I can now get into it in depth, which we never have time to do in the survey course. So, but that textbook and that course will never give us these deep dives into these people. And I think that we can be really enriched by them. So I'll say one more thing, and that is, I went to a really good school, and I had really great classmates in my architecture class. And I'm in touch with a lot, and we had a reunion, a 50th reunion about 3 or 4 years ago. So, and a third of them are dead. So we're coming up on 60. My high school's having its reunion in a couple months. I'm not going because the only ones still alive live in Miami, live in Florida. So they're getting a cruise. They're booking a cruise ship out of Miami for the 60th reunion. So, you know, the 50th reunion was great. So I won't see them for the 60th. But so I had these really interesting classmates, and one of them was a guy named Robin Friedenthal, and he was the best designer I've ever encountered. Not just the best student, best designer ever. And I teach a course in Frank Lloyd Wright. So, and tragically, in the last year of school, we lived in the same street, a block from school, and I went over to his apartment, and there was just a couple lines from the project, and it's due, you know, at noon, at 1 o'clock, it's due. Robin, what's going on? He was in the hospital. He had been having trouble with his hand for months, and he had Parkinson's disease. He ended up making the most intricate sculpture ever made. I mean, these paper models of, imagine a jack, a three-dimensional cross. Imagine two of them, one of them intersecting the other. This big in a paper model. And he just had these student assistants. And he was a really popular figure on campus till he died a few years ago. But there are these really interesting classmates, and a lot of them were really good. And as a designer, I was a B student. And I read a lot, and I went to all the lectures. And I noticed the best students in my class didn't. They were too busy doing their design work. So if you guys don't have time to read, you could be because you're A students. I had plenty of time to read because I was a B student. I read, I was plowing my way through existentialism and through, all this. And where do you get time to read? By being a B student. So I'm recommending a lot of things. You might not follow through on it until later, but I do recommend it sometime. You dive in and try some biographies of people you find interesting.